what Jonah was doing was better. There were murmurs in the market that he had grown sentimental, that his new methods made grief theatrical. There were complaints that the town would be burdened by formalities and that life required practical forgetting to continue. Jonah understood the argument. He understood, too, that his own absence of a shadow made people pity him as much as judge him. Here was a boy who could no longer do the old work with a casual hand. They did not always understand that he felt less the loss of his craft than the loss of the old moral clarity he had once pretended to hold. Yet there were signs the change mattered. A small group of women from the market came one afternoon and asked not for a softening but for a language to speak to their sons about the sea. They wanted to learn how to name the things they had held in secrecy. Jonah and old Tilda sat with them and worked to craft phrases that were precise but not cruel. They found, in their awkward phrasing, a way to teach the children to hold grief and to act. Some sailors put forward a list of mandatory witness signatures for any alteration that might affect the safety of a crew. Captain Liz Harrow, gruff and slow to soften, wrote a line in the ledger himself one dry morning, his ink blotched where the hand that had ferried so many claims trembled slightly. For any change affecting duty, 2 witnesses required. It was a small concession, but it mattered in that it recognized the public dimension of private remedies. Several evenings later, as Jonah was tucking the ledger back into its drawer, closing a chapter of ink-stained days, something else arrived. It was a scrap no envelope, slipped under his door so lightly it might have been the wind. He held it by its corner and felt the faint grit of salt on the paper. The handwriting was not his, and yet there was a familiarity to its slant, a half-formed loop on the G, that tugged at something near the back of his memory. The sentence was short: a ledger can be rewritten, but who will write back? The question sat in the lamplight like a new kind of weather. Jonah read it twice, and his breathing became the measure of his attention. He set the scrap on the table beside the ledger, and looked at the pages he had just finished. The new notations were neat, the interlaced circles marking potential returns, the columns of context plain and honest. He had made space for testimony and for witnesses. He had asked the town to be accountable, to stop hiding the cost of its relief. But the scrap's question was not simply rhetorical. It asked who would hold Jonah to the same standards he imposed on others. If the ledger was now a communal instrument, who would consult it about him? Who would sign as a witness to his absence? The ledger could record the ways he helped. It could not, without a witness, restore what had been taken from him. He had no name to write back into his own life. Whoever had slipped the note under his door had given him, by that single line, a new task: to consider his own ledger entry as something to open to others, to allow others to put words beside his absence. It was, he thought suddenly, the precisely proper and bewildering thing to do. He did not sleep well that night. He lay awake thinking of how his hand had steadied in the months since he began to rewrite the book. He thought of the woman who had wanted a lighter sleep and had kept the laughter, of old Tilda's steady, unblinking eyes, of Mara's rope-burned palms. He thought of Faye's half-smile in the doorway and Gideon's nervous, ordered hands. He thought, too, of Elias' catalogues, and how their tidy language had tried to pretend that memory could be arranged without living consequence. In the morning he rose with a small resolution. He would not make the ledger only into a public instrument. It would also be a place where his own absence could be accounted for, where others could be invited to witness the contours of his missing shadow. He would invite people to sit with him, to read the pages that spoke of what he had done and of what had been done to him. He would ask for witnesses not only to the trades he arranged but to the emptiness that sometimes widened inside him. It was, he thought, a terrifying thing to seek the kind of intimacy he had long avoided. But the ledger had taught him, in its thin, patient way, that accountability need not be an accusation. It could be a shared keeping. He made tea and wrapped the scrap in a clean bit of cloth, like a relic, and went out into the morning fog. The quay smelled of early fish and rope tar. Gulls argued over the trash. As he walked, he planned the meeting he would call. He imagined old Tilda's voice stating the ritual aloud, imagined Mara's blunt questions shaping the form of witness. He felt, for the first time in a long while, an odd lightness, not the frivolous kind that came from making someone else lighter, but a steadier buoyancy that came from arranging things honestly. At the end of the day's work, as he pinned a new header into the ledger entries open to witness, owner requested review, an echo of wind moved across the pages. Someone had left a mark on an earlier page where he had written, long ago, under a different ledger heading, taken, anonymous, time unspecified. Where he had once crossed the line and closed it, there was now a small smudge, as if a finger had tried to smudge the ink backward into the page. He did not know whose hand had done it. He did not for a single breath want to know. There are matters, he thought with a new patience, that require not only method but also the courage to let others see you resisting the habit of secrecy. He closed the ledger and set it on the table, its pages quieter than they had been in months. He left the scrap of paper. A ledger can be rewritten, but who will write back? Folded and pinned to the front page like a question mark, the door to old Tilda's shop was open. She stood inside arranging jars, looking up once as he passed. Mara called from across the quay, asking whether he would help mend a net. He answered in the ordinary way, with a yes that carried the new weight of someone who had learned to say yes in the presence of witnesses. The ledger, he thought as the fog thickened and the town's sounds became modest and private, could not, by itself, restore all that had been traded. It could, however, be a place where the town practiced saying what it meant. That practice might be awkward. It might undo conveniences people had thought necessary. It might, in time, make some people resentful or fearful. It might also, if people did the hard work and if witnesses kept their eyes open, make room for a kind of common remembering that felt steadier than the old, private mercies. He paused at the rail of the quay and looked down at the water, where the tide moved like a patient hand. The lamplight caught on a ripple and flashed, and for a moment he could imagine the ledger open between two people, each reading the other's lines aloud and, in the reading, making themselves known. He folded his hands into the sleeves of his coat and felt the damp that always gathered there, the familiar small discomfort that had, somehow, come to feel like a marker of the life he was learning to lead. There would be more work to do. There would be disputes. Some would accuse him of turning melancholy into a public ceremony. Others would praise him for giving words back to people. Either criticism might be true in its narrow way. Jonah could accept both. He had come to know that the ledger's rewriting was less about perfect solutions than about keeping a form of attention. He had, in losing a shadow, found a new way to stand beside those who were reshaping themselves. As he walked back toward old Tilda's, the fog seemed to press the town into a single, private breathing. Someone he did not yet know had slid a question under his door the night before. Jonah put his hand to the inside pocket of his coat, where he kept the folded scrap, and felt the roughness of the paper. He had decided, out of a new humility, to ask others to read what he could not yet say aloud. The ledger could be rewritten, yes, but the act of rewriting required readers, witnesses, the intent to look at hard things together. He tucked the scrap into the ledger's front page, and at the top of the next clean sheet, wrote in slow, deliberate strokes, Entry 0, Witnesses requested. For the boy who collected shadows, he left the rest of the page blank and pinned it with a small safety pin to the first leaf. He thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that there is a particular courage in inviting another person to watch you be undone. Perhaps that courage would be returned. Perhaps it would not. Either way, there would be finally writing back. He did not notice then the small movement at the edge of the quay, a figure slipping between crates, a dark coat and a hurried step. The fog took the person and kept them, as it kept so many secrets. Jonah turned toward old Tilda's door, and the sound of the bell as it rang felt, to him, like the beginning of something that would not be tidy. The ledger was open. The town had begun to learn how to read. He had asked for witnesses. The question pinned to his page would have an answer in time, or it would remain an open line. Either way, he had placed the matter where people could see it, and so he stepped inside, the lamplight following him as if it knew to be careful. Outside, the tide moved, indifferent and patient, and somewhere in the town a jar against glass clinked once, as if someone were opening something they had kept closed for too long. The lamp on Jonah's table threw a narrow island of light across the ledger's scuffed cover. Beyond that circle, the quay dissolved back into the fog, a world reticent in its contours. He sat with the ledger open, the pages had rewritten drying under a flat palm. The redactions and annotations made the book feel less like a weapon and more like a record kept after a funeral, something meant to be read slowly, carefully, and with permission. He had thought for a long time that the ledger was proof of his usefulness. Now it felt like proof of the work he would have to continue in a different way. Mara stood nearby, her hands busy with a jar of salted herring she had bought for their supper. The lamplight found the soft, permanent crease on her brow and made salt freckles on her skin look like fine dust. She moved without ceremony. She set down the jar, wiped her hands on her apron, and did not stand back as if she were uncertain where to be. In the months since the council hearing, she had been what she had always been, immediate, practical, and impatient with both sentiment and evasion. Jonah liked the steadiness of her presence the way a man might like a harbor in a rough wind. "Are you keeping it like that forever?" she asked, nodding at the ledger. When he hesitated, she added, "Or do you mean to set it on fire and pretend nothing happened?" No, Jonah's voice was small. He had not known how to say the new size of his plans. He slid the page a little closer to himself and pointed to the margin where had written in a careful, patient hand, consent clauses, witness lines, a notation system that insisted on a before, during, and after. "I want people to see what was done. I want them to come and sign, to say if they want things returned or left, to know that nothing happens without them." Mara watched him for a moment the way someone watches a fish in a net to see if it fights. "That will be a good sort of trouble," she said. "You will have people coming instead of going away. They will ask things you cannot answer. You will have to say no." Jonah imagined that and felt a quick, clarifying itch. Saying no had been one of the things he'd never wanted to do. It had been easier to decide for others in the unspeaking hush of the docks than to refuse them aloud. He had, in his earlier trade, believed that he was making choices that spared people from the little murders of memory. Now he understood that sparing someone could sometimes be another kind of erasure. "We'll have to set rules," old Tilda said when she later came in with a pot of weak tea balancing on two nimble palms. She moved as if each syllable of her body were a small ceremony. The shop smelled of dried lavender and starch. Consent, witnesses, a cooling-off period. No more taking by promise alone, no more trades for a coin and a candle. Keep the ledger open. Keep the page for return requests. And if anyone asks you to take something that feels like the shape of a child's face, you refuse. Jonah made a face as if at a bitter taste. "People have asked for that. And you have not always refused," Tilda said. It was not a rebuke so much as a naming, "but you will learn. We all learn by the things we cannot undo." There had been so many of those things to learn by lately. The council's compromise had left ragged edges. The vote had not banned trades entirely, which would have been too tidy and too cruel, but it had placed them under new rules. A registry had been drawn up, officers trained in the modest bureaucracy of memory. Jonah had given testimony to the council with the same careful restraint he used when loosening a shadow from a foot. He described processes, suggested consent forms, and admitted with a plainness that had felt like exposure that some things should never have been taken. His words had landed in people's memory like pebbles in a still pond. The ripples had reached many shores. The first weeks were noisy. People who had traded away small things asked for them back in ones and twos. The memory of a daughter's lullaby, the ache of missing a mother on a winter night. Some returned willingly. They wanted to know who they had been before convenience had softened them. Others came and trembled at the thought and left begging not to be made to remember. Jonna had sat with both kinds of visits. He had learned to ask, "Do you want this back because you are curious, or because you need it to be you?" He had learned, painfully, that there were memories that when returned made life harder in the short term but truer in the long. A man named Thomas Reed had come in the late autumn with his head down and his hands clasped, like someone bracing for a blow. Jonna remembered him from years earlier, a wide-shouldered man who had once taken to loosening a child's hand on a dock, so the boy would find his way again. The man's softened shadow had made him gentler in the mornings, but had also smoothed out a particular kindness, the sort of inclination to linger and listen that had once led him, unremarked, to help a stranger who was older and lost. He had come back because his daughter had asked him, in a voice like a sudden call, if he remembered how to hum the old hymn. Jonna watched the reunion like a surgeon watching a limb reconnect. It was not without pain. The man's eyes found the child's, and there was the strange, awkward recognition of someone who had been remade. "You are my father," the girl said, and the names of the small things tumbled forward. The man cried once and then kept still, as if he were conserving himself for the future. Jonna felt strangely proud and very nearly ashamed. He had given this back, but not without cost. Not everyone wanted such a cost. A woman who had traded away the memory of a certain night's shame left the ledger's office in a cold, brittle happiness. "Why would I take it back?" she asked Jonna, snapping the lid on a tin of mending pins as if it were a box of secrets. "I am freer. I sleep." "You ought to have slept with your eyes open about it," old Tilda replied, which made Jonna laugh, and then the woman was gone. The town was being rearranged in small domestic ways. Habits resumed, but differently. Elias Venn had retreated. He moved in grey now in the margins of the market, avoided the council's committees, and took less pleasure in the exact ordering of things. His curiosity had been slowed by the knowledge that Jonna had seen his back room, and had not simply reported. Jonna had asked for a kind of reckoning, not wholesale ruin. Elias had accepted, with that pale arrogance he could not quite shed, that he had been wrong in the shape of his protections. Whether he repented or simply found less overt ways to collect, Jonna could not say. People would always seek to hide pain from themselves. The question was how the town would meet such seeking with constraint rather than commerce. The new ways of doing things were halting. At the quay, the harbor's men learned that forgetting some detail of a lane could not be left to a pocketful of coins. Captain Liz Harrow, pragmatic as ever, had grumbled at the council's interference, but when it came to the narrowness of the pier and the lives in his crew, he had become, despite himself, a cautious ally. "You can tidy a rope, Jonna," he had told him once, "but you cannot tidy a man." Some people were angry. There were meetings at the Fishmonger's Arms where the old comfort of softening was mourned as an old economy that provided predictability. Others were relieved. The town's rhythms changed like a harbor adjusting to a new tide, slow, stiff, and sometimes catastrophic in small places. Jonna found himself spending his days mediating small quarrels about memories returned and letters from people who wanted to know if the ledger's entries could be used as proof in minor disputes. He became, in a gentle, porous way, a civil servant of grief. Mara watched him as he did this. She never watched with the odd distance others sometimes did. She watched with a readiness to say what needed to be said. "You are better at this when you do not pretend it is all neat," she told him one evening as they mended nets together by the back of the shop. "People come with aches. You must hold them for a while, let it be messy." They learned the mess together. They set chairs for waiting people. They taught the registry folk to hold the kettle, and not the judgments. And they practiced the new script. Jonna had drafted questions that asked about consent, about who might be hurt if a memory returned, about whether the person asking had considered the suffering that might re-enter a home. It felt like a patchwork of decency in a town prone to easy fixes. Jonna kept thinking of the ledger not as a way to hide things, but as a place to make undoings visible. Old Tilda's shop became, Unexpectedly, a kind of parlor for recounting. People came to her to read their names aloud in a public witness ceremony. She taught them to speak in a voice that did not seek absolution but wanted acknowledgement. Saying what you have lost is not the same as losing it all over again, she told a weeping baker who had asked to have a certain remorse returned. It is the telling that knits it into the rest of you. There were small, tender rituals. A cooling off week after a request. A witness signature. The presence of a neighbor or family member during an exchange. Jonah insisted that no one be alone when part of them was to be returned. This was not only a bureaucratic safety. It was a moral one. He had seen how easy it was for a returned memory to be a weapon in a home, the resurrected blame used as leverage in arguments, the old truths sharpened into accusation. Having someone there to help carry that first night made a difference. A change of habit, small but structural, could make what felt inevitable into something survivable. Faye Corcoran came by sometimes. She had not stayed with Elias. The apprenticeship had shown her that the neat ordering of sorrow could feed vanity. She told Jonah that she had taken a job mending sails and that catalogs had been traded for real, rough tasks. She brought him notes, small things Elias had never thought worth saving, but that spoke toward a softer use of knowledge. She was careful with her loyalties now, like a person carrying a lit candle in both hands. On a quiet evening near the end of winter, Jonah walked the quay alone. The fog lay on the water like an old shawl. He watched the town from a distance, and tried to make a map in his head of what had been set right, and what had not. A woman who worked at the bakery had recounted to him, only that afternoon, a memory returned, the smell of her husband's pipe when he came home before he died. It had steadied her in a way that made Jonah want to believe the Ledger's new life had been worth the trouble. But there were other things. The sailor who could not name his son's face upon being asked. The widow who cursed Jonah for unmaking a comfortable forgetting, who made him feel the sharpness of the choice he had taken. As he walked, a child ran past, the kind of small, unstoppable boy who made his mother shout and his dog bark. The lamplight caught the child's shadow first, long and stumbling, then squashed into a brief, black shape as the child turned. For a moment the child's shadow slid between Jonah's own feet. Jonah felt, absurdly, as if he had touched something living. He crouched and let the boy stand over his palm, as if he were looking for a handhold. The boy giggled, and did not know the particulars of the town's quarrels. He knew only that shadows could be chased and caught. Jonah watched him go and felt something like a small, decisive warmth. It was not the warmth of triumph, nor the illusion of having fixed everything. It was the warmth of being present, of knowing he could still be part of the unremarkable exchanges that made a life. He had, in the months since his own shadow was lost, learned to be known in ways that did not depend on the Ledger's authority. The Ledger remained a heavy thing, but it had been, in part, redeemed by the care he now insisted upon. That night they ate salt herring and bread, and Mara counted the coins they had saved by mending rather than buying. The conversation was small, a neighbor's bad cough, a child's new tooth, the council's next meeting. When silence came, comfortable and not total, Jonah turned the Ledger face down and closed it. The cover creaked in a familiar domestic way. "Will you sleep better now?" Mara asked. "I do not know about better," Jonah said, "but I sleep with my eyes a little more open." She laughed softly. "That is all I asked for." He left the Ledger on the table and went to the window. In the street below, two old men argued about the best way to mend a net. A dog barked. The sound of a fiddler reached them from the tavern like a folded letter. Jonah thought of Elias, gray and distant, of Faye with her quick, careful hands, of old Tilda with her eyes that did not blink. He thought of the Ledger and the pages that would never be able to put back. Everything they had once softened. Still, in the space of the harbor and the fog there was a small movement toward what Tilda had called tempered honesty. It would be a slow thing. There would be people who left the town because they could not bear the return of some truth, and there would be others who stayed because they could finally see themselves. Jonah had thought, for many long years, that the work of repair was about making people comfortable. It had taken losing his shadow to teach him that repair was about presence, the willingness to be there at the edge of someone's pain when it stirs, to find the ordinary mechanisms that let people carry grief, rather than letting it be outsourced. He turned out the lamp and the room went soft as cloth. Beyond the window a child called, and a shadow leapt against the wall of the opposite house, as if it were in a hurry to be somewhere. Jonah stood a while in the dark and listened. He could not tell if the town would ever be the same as it had been, or if that was even desirable. The ledger sat on the table, a quieter instrument than it had been, and his hands felt empty of a thing he had always thought essential. But there was, in that emptiness, a new smallness, a space to be given away and filled by others. He had been the boy who collected shadows. He would remain a man who tended memory. If this was a demotion, it was also, he thought, an honest one. There was, he realized, a kind of companionship in the ordinary, the sharing of tea, the passing of a broom, the way a neighbor would lend a hand without asking a price. He had begun to learn these economies: no ledger entries, no labels, only names and hands. Before he went to bed, Mara tied a bit of rope around his wrist, a looped knot that would remind him, when he woke, that he had a place to come back to. Jonah watched her fingers because he wanted to remember the exact way she folded the rope. The knot felt like an argument and a promise. He slept poorly, but he slept. At dawn he woke to the smell of sea and coffee, and when he opened the window he saw, across the quay, a small group of people standing under a lamplight. They were reading from the ledger aloud, a ritual that old Tilda had suggested and that had become a Thursday practice: names read, consent confirmed, songs hummed. The sound of people making a public thing of formerly private exchanges. Jonah stood and watched them from his sill, and a small, steady contentment warmed the place in his chest that had been cold for so long. Someone laughed, the sound bright and unself-conscious, and a child's shadow stretched in their game between two women who argued over the right way to knot a net. Jonah thought, with an ache and a thankfulness that tasted like salt, that belonging could be renewed in ways that were not tidy. A ledger could be a testament instead of a secret. Loss could be preserved as part of a life rather than smoothed away into hollowness. He closed the window and reached for the ledger. He did not feel the absence of his shadow, as he once had no hole of cold in the morning light, but as a fact, a part of his shape altered. That absence would always be a companion. He had traded the old instrument of authority for the labor of presence, and in that trade, found that there was a kind of quiet dignity in being merely useful, merely neighborly, merely available. The town would go on with its uncomfortable decisions, its returned recollections, and its comfortable forgettings. Jonah would be present for many of them, witness and steward. For now he put the ledger into a drawer and drew the curtain, and from the darkness at the window someone called a name he had known as a boy, and a shadow ran along the wall like a small, foolish promise. When he lay down, his last thought was not a plan but a listening. He had learned late that the work of memory was not the work of making things lighter, but the work of learning how to hold what is heavy. The harbor breathed beneath the boards. Outside, a child's shadow stumbled and then righted itself. Jonah, unmoving, felt a small consolation that in a town of fog and salt-sore air, people were trying, imperfectly, to be honest with each other again. The ledger would stay on the table. The knot on his wrist would loosen and be retied. He would wake and walk the quay and be, in the small ways he had always wanted, part of a place that kept its faces visible even when they hurt. And half an hour later, when the morning had warmed enough for the fog to thin, a woman from the council came by with a list and a cup of strong tea. She sat and read the names aloud, and Jonah listened with a patient attention that no ledger had ever been able to teach him. Outside, a child chased his shadow across the quay, and Jonah felt the shadow brush his bare toes. It did not return what he had lost, but it touched him with a new kind of belonging, a belonging that he could hold without asking anyone to forget. The feeling was small and fragile, and it was enough to make him stand and step outside into the thin, honest light.